Hello cuties, welcome back. Today we are going to get nice and dirty and we are going to weather up this KV-1 ready to build a diorama. Sit back, chill out, check it out. So this is the equipment that I'm using. We are using some Winsor & Newton oil paints. We are using some MIG enamels and some old Ford World weathering powders that I've had for years. They've got nice colours that I want to use. We're going to be doing some dot filtering, and then we're going to be using the oil paints to map out some of the dust and the dirt and the grime that we want, and move on to some rust, some streaks, and then some pigments. Again, as it says in the bottom, apologies for some of the shoddy camera work. I've just got a new camera and yeah, it took me a minute to get used to it. So dot filtering, for those of you who don't know, is using oil paints to add a filter over the armour. Because this is going to be set in Stalingrad, I wanted a fairly cold, muted tone, and Russian 4BO is fairly bright. So what I'm doing is I'm using a fair few cold tones, a few little warm tones like the brown in there and some green. And then what you do is you basically blend it all together and gradually remove the paint using a fairly dry brush. If you do put too much on it though, which I have a tendency of doing, this is a fairly new technique for me, I use a cotton bud with some enamel thinners on it, and then I just tidy it up, because especially when you're stippling it on, like on the flat areas, it can just gunk up. As you can see, that's the finished effect, or the finishing of the effect on the front of the tank. So it gives you some really nice subtle streaks and kind of mutes down that Russian 4BO. For those of you that don't know, the reason that I'm using the cardboard for my palette is because oil paints have got a lot of oil in them. So for miniature painting, that's not ideal. So you sit them on there for about half an hour to an hour, or even overnight, and you let all of the oil soak out, and they're much easier to work with. As you can see, some of those areas are kind of filled out. The areas where dirt and grime would build up. Now, I did some oil dusting before, and then went and did the chipping and the weathering. However, the footage was awful and I really wasn't happy with the result. So this is me redoing this, starting with the lightest colour, and then eventually you kind of build up to the darkest, blend it all in, stipple it all in where you want it. So you apply it in the corners and then kind of feather it out as you go, and it kind of leaves these dusty marks, which I then kind of tidy up a little bit with mineral thinners, and then move on to the brown, and then I go gradually darker. Again, kind of feathering these bits out just so I can move some of that dust where I've put on a little too much oil paint, the areas where it would sit around the hatches and around some of the corners and what have you, and clean it up with a Q-tip. going over with that brown. And then use a grey, and I use a black as well, just to kind of darken those areas out. Especially where the engine sits, I kind of went a little heavier with the black, just so it's kind of oil and grime and what have you. I want to work out a way, I'm sure there's a paint I can use to get more of a glossy oil effect. I just didn't have one with me. That's something that I can look into picking up in the future. Sponge chipping, I use the lightest highlight colour from the MIG Russian 4BO set to give me some light chips, and then I go over with a grey, fairly light grey, citadel grey I had lying about, and then brush paint on some of the chips where the metal's been exposed, and then I can apply rust over that. Areas where I go a little too heavy, I just use a watered down, a really wet brush, and I just kind of feather it out and then remove it with a Q-tip. And my fiance's tweezers. She doesn't know that I've stolen, so yeah, I'm sorry when you watch this. And going over with a really small brush with some of that light grey, I'm kind of picking out some of those chipped areas, some of those larger areas where I can use, and some of the edges, so I can use the rust effects to bring those out. So for the rust, I use a mix of MIG and AK rust effects. Just a couple of different effects. I use one for streaking, and I use one mainly out of the top of the pot. To pick out some of those flat rusty areas. It gives a nice bit of variation as well, because they're slightly different colours. I then use the rust almost as a filter. So using a cocktail stick and a brush with very, very little of the rust enamel on, just kind of splash it over the tank. Any of the bigger droplets you can clean off with mineral spirits, and it just adds another extra bit of texture, another extra bit of depth, and a little more interest to some of these flat panels. The tracks, I use the MIG track wash, paint those on, and then use their streaking light rust. And just kind of wet blend it into the tank, into the tracks in certain areas, just to make some, give a bit of variation to the tracks. That I'll then kind of polish up some of the raised areas that would be Moving on to the pigment powders is where I use those Forge World weathering powders. I wanted to make the tank look like it had been fighting in this urban environment for a fairly long time. So I was using some greys. I was using a rust deposit, but what I did is I mixed it with the grey to kind of tone it down a little bit so it looked more like brick dust. It's not perfect, but I'm pretty happy with it. I used Pigment Fixer to fix some of the heavier lumps in place, just so it again adds a little more texture and feather out some of the areas where I just wanted a bit of dust caught up in the corners, just to add a little bit of variation and interest, especially onto those fenders and areas like that. Bits where rust and dust to kind of get caught up in certain bits and pieces, I add a little more Pigment Fixer, just so it gives a bit of texture. It will fit the tank into the diorama and the way that I want the tank to look. Now, idiot me here, forgot to press record when I added some rubble onto the tank, which you can see in the photos at the start and at the end. I added some base ready from Geek Gaming Scenics just into certain areas where I'd put the most kind of heavy amounts of pigments, just so it looks like, you know, there's been explosions and dust and rubble has kind of been thrown up onto the tank, and it does look like that tank hasn't moved in a long time. I did have a look for some information, couldn't really find any. So I added those on, and when I came to edit it, realised that I never pressed record when I was trying to film it. It also helps to tone down those rust deposits, which looked a lot more rusty than I kind of wanted. I wanted to kind of get that brick dust effect, huh? Yeah, polishing up some of those bare metal bits. Some of the welds as well, because welds take a lot longer to rust than rolled steel and cast steel, so some of those weld beads that are on the model, I then used a pencil just to polish those bits up as well. So yeah, I hope you like it. I'm really pleased with this. Considering this is the third scale model that I've built, it's a definite improvement on the other two. And I'm really looking forward to building the diorama. I do stream most Saturdays and do a bit of a hobby stream, so come check those out. Or if you're into gaming, I stream Tuesday, Thursday and Sunday night. I hope you liked it. Give us a like, give us a subscribe. Any suggestions, any comments, criticisms, leave them in the comments, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.